YouTube do-it-yourselfers. This is a 1984 Evinrude, 15 horsepower, carburetor rebuild. Let's get to it. First thing you're going to want to do is take the cowling off. That lever. Pull up on that. Pull back a little bit. Comes right off. Piece of cake. Next thing you're going to want to do is pull out these 4 screws. For this, you will either want a flathead screwdriver or a 1/4 inch nut driver. After you take the screws out, top cover comes off. Below that, you have 2 flathead screws. These need to come out next. Next, you will want to pull out your slow speed adjustment knob. It literally pulls straight out. After you pull out the low speed adjustment knob, you can start loosening this up. Keep in mind that the adjustment screw for the low speed adjustment is still here. You just kind of got to manipulate it as such to get this out. After you pull the air intake off, there's a thin metal bracket that holds the choke lever in place. It's no longer attached. It just comes off as such. After that, your choke lever can slide out. You do not need to remove it any further than that. At this point, we need to address the starter assembly. This bolt will remove this entire housing. It takes a 9/16 wrench. You need to make sure that the flywheel is in this orientation for this bolt to clear the flywheel. I cannot stress the importance of holding this entire unit together as a sandwich. Reason being, down here, this is the tag end of a spring that is preloaded inside of this housing. Not too much unlike a tape measure spring, but this thing has got considerable more force to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch the bottom of this housing with my thumb and the top of this with my index finger. I'm going to loosen this bolt, but I'm only going to loosen it until it's out of the threads. I do not want to lose its position with the multiple holes that it has to clear through with all of these gears. I simply want to loosen it from the threads, and that will loosen up this entire housing. Once the housing's loose, with the bolt still in the holes, I will pull this out ever so slightly. I'm going to push that bolt back in through the whole housing while I'm still holding the entire housing together. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to take some electrical tape and I'm going to wrap the entire unit in electrical tape. Once it's wrapped in electrical tape, I can lay it off to the side without worrying about it uncoiling. Mind you, I'm pinching this during this entire process. Just getting a feel for it as I go with the threads. Giving it a little wiggle so I can get this bolt out without it binding up on anything. Bolts out. Turn it over. Make sure that bolt sticks with it. I'm going to hold this whole thing firmly, pinching it the entire time I'm doing this. Electrical tape as much as you can on here to lock this all into place. That should do it. I'm going to take the tab end of this, kind of bend it over on itself so I don't have to go looking for it later. Now this unit is set. It is still very much under tension with the spring, but at this point we can just kind of lay it over the side of the front of the motor and it is out of our way at this point. Our next step is going to be to take this screw out. Behind this plastic piece here is a washer. Be very careful when you pull this screw out that you get your finger behind here and hold that washer into place. If that washer falls down, it generally has a great shot straight down the shifting mechanism, and it can be taken out without dismantling the motor, but it is a bit of a pain. So here we go. I can feel that washer with the tip of my fingernail, and I'm just going to let it rest on my fingernail while I pull this out. A little tip about this entire thing: before you start taking linkage apart on anything, whether it be timing or throttle linkage of any nature, take a picture of this on any motor that you're working on. Take a picture of your linkage. See where it's at in relation to itself, whether it be with your smartphone or a digital camera. That way later down the road, when you go to put it all back together, you have a reference point of how it all looked, as opposed to guessing as to which way this linkage bar went, whether it was twisted that way or this way or whatever. So I'm at the end of these threads. I've got my fingernail on the back of that washer. I can feel it back there. I'm going to take this off. This is the washer I was telling you about. You do not want to let that fall down into the motor compartment. That washer's out. The screw is out. Now with this linkage, you just got to twist it a little bit. Doesn't take much. That pops off. You could leave this on if you'd like, or you can pop it off as well. I like to take them off again so that they don't fall down into any inaccessible places further down in the motor compartment. Next thing we need to do at this point is take this nut off, and there's a corresponding nut on the opposite side here. There's only two of them, here and here. It takes a 7/16 wrench. It's hard to get in there, but again, try really hard not to let them just drop once you get them to the end of their throw. Something I like to use, long pair of needle nose pliers. I can kind of keep my hand next to it with the pliers. That way when it gets close, I can kind of rub the pliers on it. That way if it does come loose, much like that. I'll do the exact same thing with the other side. This is the nut on the other side. I'm going to hold on to this carburetor a little bit, kind of give it a little jiggle, so I can kind of feel when I'm getting towards the end of my threads on this nut, so I don't accidentally drop it. Once that nut's removed, the carburetor is free, with the exception of the fuel line. Which I find it easier to pull off once the carburetor's out. It's a barbed in fitting on a rubber hose, so just give it a little twist, pull it out, and your carburetor's free. So here's our carburetor, free from the motor. The very first thing I'm going to do is take this screw, which is a low-speed idle screw. I'm going to reference this. I haven't turned it or tweaked it. It hasn't been adjusted at all since the time it was running. I'm going to take a Sharpie, and I'm going to just use any reference point. It doesn't matter. But in this case, I'm going to use whatever this is as a reference point. I'm going to put a Sharpie line on here, just on the edge of that. At this point, I'm going to take the knob for this. I'm going to count how many turns it takes to thread it in to seat. Now, when it seats, you do not want to jam on it. You just want to get it to a tension point just to where it's snug. You over tighten this and you can damage the tip of the screw or its seat. So I'm just going to count this, how many turns. You can count half turns or full turns, it's up to you. Whatever works for you, as long as you know what the reference is. So this is in line with that spot in the carburetor, right? So I'm going to turn this. So that's a half a turn. It's about another quarter turn, maybe just a hair more. But I'm resting right now. I can feel it. I'm resting on that seat. I'm going to go ahead and back it back out to where it was, and I'm going to write that down on something. So I don't lose track of that when I go to reassemble this carburetor. That gets you back to your original settings, so you at least have a good base point to start with. If you take this out and unscrew it completely and don't have any reference point, it's going to be difficult to find that point once you get the motor running again. In many cases, it won't even start if you don't have this into a certain setting. So make that reference point before you tear anything apart on this carburetor. Doesn't matter where you start with this carburetor necessarily. I'm going to start with the bowl. I want to see what this looks like. Flathead screws. Pull this apart. Most carburetors, all these screws are going to be the same length. But if you're tearing something else apart, notice how long the screws are when you're taking them out. If you get a variation in size, you'll want to note where that variation is so that you can put it all back together the same way it came apart. And you are going to dump gas out of this thing, especially if it's been running recently. Now, if you've got a rebuild kit, good for you, go for it. You don't have to worry about gaskets or seals or anything like that. I do have a rebuild kit, and I'm going to put this in here. If this is simply a tear down and clean process, you'll want to be really careful when you get into this part. If it's sticking at all, just be so gentle to tear it apart. This one wasn't sticking at all, so we're in pretty good shape there. Oh, it is sticking just a little bit. But if you're going to reuse these gaskets, which I recommend getting a rebuild kit, but if you end up tearing this apart and reusing these gaskets, just be so careful as to how you're taking them apart so you don't crack them or break them or anything. I'm going to set that aside. That doesn't look too bad in there. Now, these old cork floats. Ugh, I don't know what to tell you about them. Get them out of there. They work great for the years that they were intended to use. This is a 1984 motor. These cork gaskets just fall apart over time, and little bits and pieces of them fall off, and they fall into the jets, and it doesn't take very much for them to start clogging things up. So I've got the bowl off. I've got this float here. Now, at this position, don't be turning this side to side, because this little pin here isn't held in by anything. It's simply just sitting there. I'm going to take this pick tool and just kind of push on this ever so slightly. Be really careful that you don't lose any of these parts. Some of these are in the rebuild kit, some of them are not. So usually what I'll do is I'll take that, I'll just throw it in that bowl. Now at this point, the float is loose. But do you see this little needle? It's held on by a little clip. Now if I were to rotate this the opposite way that I just rotated this, this will all fall off and it'll be gone. And you won't be able to find it very easily. So keep in mind the orientation again. This is coming off towards the fuel line. I want to put this all back together. Realistically, it might not matter which side that's clipped on. But they put it together that way. I want to put it back together that way. So there's a clip and that needle valve. Cork float. If you're reusing it, reuse it, but keep in mind you're probably going to have problems with them. Now, at this point, flathead screwdriver with these little flats here on either side. They will unscrew. Make sure you're using the correct size screwdriver for these things. Don't be chewing and biting at it. They shouldn't be that tight to begin with, but if you start breaking off little pieces of brass in here, you're going to have a mess with it. There's a washer associated with that too, so keep that in mind. At this point, I'm just taking everything apart. Take notice of what you're taking apart and where it's at. Like I said before, if you need to, step by step, take pictures of this so you can come back and reference which one of these went to which hole if you don't know, if you're not familiar with these. Next thing I'm going to take apart is this low idle adjustment screw. You can use a pair of pliers, you can use the handle that it came with. Keep in mind we've already timed out where it should rest once we reassemble. But do you see how much thread there is here? How much adjustment there is? That's why it's so important to figure out where it was set at initially. Because, you know, I mean, you could drive yourself crazy trying to find out where that spot is again. Now there is a seal on the screw to keep this thing from leaking. But more important than that is this needle here. Now when we screwed this in, it's resting in a seat that corresponds with this taper. If we had over tightened it, we can start damaging this taper or the seat on the other end, or both. If that happens, nothing good. It loses its ability to regulate itself the way it was designed to do. So I'm just going to set this aside for right now. Just be really careful, don't damage the tip of that at all. Don't drop it on the concrete floor or whatever have you. Now at this point, we're open up here, right? Little gasket filament in here of some sort. I'll pop that out. Again, I'm just going to save it. At this point, we've pulled this screw out. We've pulled these out. At this point, what I generally do is I'll just take some carb cleaner and I'll just start blasting these ports out. Wear safety glasses. I can't tell you how many times I've been hit in the eyes with this stuff. You spray it in here and it comes out at a 45 the other way. You think you're good and then it shoots you right square in the eyeball or the nose or something. Wear safety glasses. You really should be wearing gloves, but yeah, you know. This will make a mess everywhere as well. So when you do this, just be prepared. You're going to end up with stuff all over your floor or whatever. Throw down some rags, some floor dry, whatever you want. I like rags better than floor dry because if something does break loose and fall out, I'm not sifting through a bunch of floor dry to find it later. Now, carb cleaner is the best for carburetors, generally speaking. I've got brake cleaner. That's all I got, so I'm going to roll with it. Either way, brake cleaner, carb cleaner, they come with these nice little straws. It makes it really convenient to get down inside of these ports. Like I said, wear safety glasses. When you spray this, it's going to come out. It's going to come out in a couple different directions or one direction. Murphy's Law will have it that it'll come out and shoot you right square in the eye. So wear safety glasses. That's one. Two. Getting down in his throat here where that needle was at. While I'm spraying this, I can see it coming out of another port somewhere on the carburetor, whether it be down the throttle body or down another port, whatever have you. When you're doing this, while you're spraying that, make sure it's coming out of somewhere when you shoot a hole like that. Now, like if you've got a bolt hole or something, or wherever your nuts were at, like a screw, obviously it's not going to come out of anywhere. But where you pull out your jets or your needles or anything like that, you want to make sure that it's coming out of somewhere while you're spraying it. If it's not, it means you've got a clog somewhere and you've got to keep working at it until you get that clog out. This carburetor is not in really bad a shape, so I'm just going to go ahead and roll with this right now. I'm going to clean it up a little bit more, but I don't think I'm going to tear it down any more than this. It blasts out pretty clean. I'm happy with it. Now, if you've got a carb rebuild kit, go for it. Rebuild the whole thing. At the very least, try to replace these floats, these cork floats. I mean, you can see how chipped up this thing is and how much gunk is on here. It really wouldn't take much effort for me to flake a little tiny piece of that off and get down into a jet, and then that's it. You're tearing this thing apart again, trying to clean it out, trying to wonder what's going on. The other thing is make sure that these butterflies move pretty freely. They're spring-loaded, obviously. Make sure they just float, you know. They shouldn't have any hindering to them at all. If they're kind of caked and they're not moving freely, go crazy with this stuff. You got to get that stuff cleaned out of there. Maybe even some WD-40 to kind of help it out a little bit. But at this point, I'm just going to go ahead, replace the float. And this. Now, the tip of this is rubber. Sometimes they're steel on steel seats. Sometimes they're a rubber seat on the tip of this. Now, on older carburetors, this is going to get brittle, and it doesn't take hardly any effort for this to crack, break. It's gone. Even if you don't have a rebuild kit, you should try to at least get one of these before you take your carburetor apart. I've broken these before, not had an extra one on hand. It's a bad day. I would replace these along with this. If you don't replace anything else in the carburetor, replace these. Ideally your gaskets as well. But these, replace them. Makes a world of difference. I'm also going to take a moment to tell you I can't stress how much importance it is to get a good quality rebuild kit when you do this. This is straight from Evinrude. You can see the float. It's plastic, it's not cork. I've purchased cheaper kits off of Amazon, various other websites, whatever. And believe it or not, I've even had them come in as soon as I rebuild the carburetor, put this gasket in, and this thing literally dissolved as soon as the gas hit it. Not all carb kits are built the same. Get the best carb kit you can get. This thing is 20 bucks. You know, a cheap one probably going to be like 15 bucks. Don't cheap out on it. Get the best carb kit you can get. So right here I have a side-by-side comparison of what I've taken out and what I'm going to put back into it. Keep in mind that sometimes some of these carburetor kits will cover a variety of carburetors. You may end up with some extra parts in some of these left over that don't fit your carburetor. And that's fine. Just keep in mind what you've taken off of it versus what you're going to put back into it. In this case, the float, the gasket, the float valve, the pivot pin for the float are all going to be replaced, along with the seat for the float valve. This needle I'm keeping. However, if you look in this gasket set, that seal versus this seal is an issue. So I'm going to obviously replace that. That could potentially have given me enough for a vacuum leak that could have been the culprit for this carburetor rebuild in the first place. Also, the bowl. I've cleaned it out. I took some steel wool and just kind of rubbed it around in there and then cleaned it out really well with either carb cleaner or brake cleaner. But you could pretty much eat off of this thing, and that's the way you want it. Everything in this carburetor you want pristine. The inside of it, anyway. The outside of it doesn't really matter that much, honestly. If you're into cosmetics and such, then so be it. Clean it up. But realistically, what you want is the inside of this thing to be as clean as humanly possible. So at this point, I'm going to start reassembling parts. This guy's not in the carb kit. I'm going to put it right back where it came from. Like I said before, make sure you got the right size screwdriver for these things. You don't want to be just cranking on them and breaking pieces of brass off. Could potentially be going down inside of the carburetor, which you just cleaned, which would essentially make this all for naught. So some people kind of get worried about the float level adjustment on these, and there really isn't any. I think in a manual, I think once you put this all together, my experience has been once it's all together, we're going to want that pretty much resting the top of this bowl float resting parallel with the mating plate here. Generally, that'll get you where you need to go. Don't start thinking you need to bend this tab back and forth and do a whole bunch of adjustments and get a ruler out and all this other stuff. Just stick it together. Like I said, keep the top of this float parallel with the casting here, and you'll be in good shape. More times than not, you don't have to do anything. It's already preset, preloaded, it's ready to go. It's the difference between the two floats here. So you can see carb kit, not such a bad deal. Now with this float valve seat, when we pulled this one off, the old one, you can see a gasket in here. New carb kit comes with the gasket. We're in pretty good shape here. So I'm just going to go ahead and roll with that. When you're putting these together, your brass going into steel. If it doesn't go in just as easy as I just did it, it means you're probably cross-threading something. don't cross thread these things. If you need to, stop, start, completely over, get it figured out. Now when I took this old one apart, I took it apart on purpose the way I did. I didn't take this pin off of here because I wanted to use it to keep the relationship the exact same between the two, the new and the old. Kind of gives me a blueprint on how to put these together if I wasn't sure. Like I said before, I wanted to make sure that I put it together the exact same way. So I'm going to put that on the same side that the inlet for the gasoline comes into. Now that needle is going to rest down inside that hole like such. We're just going to set that down for a minute. Get our pin. Carefully get this in here all the way. On this, you'll want to make sure this one has a head. Some carburetors do, some carburetors don't. Make sure you have that thing resting as deep as it will so it sets. And like I said before, this is running parallel with the body of the carburetor. You're in good shape. Just roll with it. Make absolutely sure that during all of that this clip hasn't fallen out, nothing has fallen out of this. Once it's to this point, be careful, because if you flip this over, this whole float assembly can pop out and you can lose your valve. So once you get it to this point, just keep it in this orientation. You do not need nor want to put any silicone on any gaskets on a carburetor, ever. The gasket material is flexible, it's rubbery, it will go on just fine without any silicone. The only thing silicone is going to do is over time degrade, fall into the inside of the carburetor, and clog everything up again. Do not use any silicone. Got that all put together. Just going to rest that on top of that. Start putting my screws back together. On these fine thread screws, I'll go backwards a bit until I can feel that thread bunny hopping over the start of the threads. That keeps me from cross threading it as I put it in. Now when you put it in, you don't want to just crank on the very first one you got. Just get it in there, get things aligned, keep it loose. This had a tag on it. I'm going to put the tag back on here. Same thing. Just going to rotate that screwdriver backwards until it catches, until I can feel it centering itself on the threads. Get it in there. Again, I'm not over tightening anything, I'm just getting it on there. When you're tightening these, you just want to make sure that you're tightening them cross pattern and equally. Give this a quarter turn, give this a quarter turn, give this guy a quarter turn, give this guy a quarter turn. Come back to your start point. Keep that going. The last thing you want to do is have this plate rocking on that gasket as you're tightening it down. If you over tighten one screw and then come over and over tighten another screw, you're going to be in the same boat. The idea is that you want this housing to marry up to this plate, equal pressure all the way across. You want that gasket to be a uniform pressure across there. So now at this point, we're going to put this gasket for this screw back in the carburetor. The gasket's got a little bit of a lip on it. It falls into that groove pretty nicely. Now when you put this in, the screw is probably going to thread into this plastic rubbery piece. As it does, it's going to thread into that, but it won't be timed with the threads that are in the steel casing below it. You need to be really careful when you're doing this that you do not cross thread this screw into this housing. Just feel it, right? So I'm screwing this in here. I'm just going to kind of feel it. When I finally hit the steel, I'm going to feel it. I'm just going to make sure that it goes in nice and easy. Notice I'm using this guy. I'm not using a pair of pliers or getting really crazy with a wrench or anything else. If it's going to give me any resistance, this is probably not going to handle it, and it'll back off. This will probably slip on these spines. This feels like it's set into those threads real nicely, so I think we're in good shape here. Again, I'm going to go down until it rests against the seat, which I just did that right there. Now I'm going to back this off 3/4 of a turn, which is what we decided on when we tested it the first time. There. Now my carburetor set to where it was when I started this process. It's all clean. Everything in the bowl's been changed out. Everything's been blasted out with brake cleaner, carb cleaner. Like I said, make sure these still float. Nice and easy. They should be completely free to do what they want with the resistance of the spring to close them or open them in this case. Now with the carburetor rebuilt, we're going to get back into this motor. There's a gasket right here that marries the motor to the carburetor. This guy comes off pretty easily in this case. Sometimes they're stuck. All came off in one piece. Toss it. Make sure that this mating surface here is free of any gasket material. And it is. In the carb kit that I bought, it came with a new one. We're going to use it. Get that guy on there. At this point in the video, it's up to you. If you want to keep watching, I'm going to reassemble this. But essentially, it's all put it back together the way it was taken apart. The only thing you need to know that's really critical is on this starter on the bottom, there's a tab right here. That tab corresponds with this hole. When you put this starter back into position, obviously you got to take all the tape off of it and hold it together like I was saying before, but that tab has to find its way into that hole. If it's on either side of that, it's no good. It's going to come unscrewed. Make sure that that tab there makes its way into the hole and we'll be set. That being said, we're going to put this thing back together. Basically the same way we took it apart. Take my fuel line. I'm going to hook it up to the carburetor. I can put a hose clamp on it or tighten the hose clamp on it after I get everything put in here. They're a little tricky to get into there, but once you get them started, you're in pretty good shape. The other side's going to be the same deal. Like I said before, if you've got a picture of this, if you don't know what you're doing, it makes it a lot easier. I put the rod on the carburetor first. Now I'm going to put this in second, like so. Just going to kind of rest it there for a minute. Here's where that washer comes into play. Get it on the end of those threads. And very carefully get it aligned with the hole in that carburetor. Now this wheel here will ride on a cam on the flywheel. At this point, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that that all moves like it's supposed to. And I'm adjusting the throttle linkage right now from high revs to low revs just to make sure that that all looks good, and it does. Get to address the starter again. Now, I left a little tab on the end of this so I'd be able to find it easily. I'm going to hold on to this like a sandwich. Make sure this thing doesn't come apart on me. Like I said before, this tab has got to go into that hole. Just make sure that that happens. Okay. Starter's assembled. So now we're going to reinstall the choke assembly. This arm adjusts the choke, and it fits into a groove right here on the choke lever. This plate has a saddle on either side of it, and it sandwiches that choke lever. So once you get it in position, you can kind of hold your fingers down, just make sure it all runs like it should, and it does. So then we put the lower intake housing on. Now we just put the upper intake on. When I put this knob back on the carburetor, I like to try to put them right dead center of its throw on either side. There's a stop here that hits this to keep it from over rotating either direction. By doing this in the center, when I do get it running again, it gives me full throw one way or the other. Just a preference. It's up to you, but it makes it a little more convenient than having it all the way to one side or the other at that point. To put the cowling back on, there's this tab here. We're going to rest it in that little hole down there. The front's locked in. Back's locked in. And we are complete. I hope you enjoyed the video.